I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West, so thank you for coming out tonight to our first lecture of the calendar year and our first lecture of the spring semester. Okay, I'll get a little closer. How's that? Our first lecture of the calendar year and spring semester, and on a topic that in Southern Nevada is very near and dear to our hearts, water, but we're going to talk about it in a slightly different context, a global context, and water as a criminal commodity. And I've learned a lot more than I ever knew about that just in the short time our colleague Vonda Feldbad-Brown has been here this week. I was stunned to learn that 30 to 50% of the water used around the globe is purchased illegally. So in a place where we think of water as a scarcity, applying that to the global community and to parts of the world where Vonda has traveled, including many of the most dangerous and unstable parts of the world. When we say we're glad to see Vonda here, we literally are glad to see her here. So I'm going to be brief, but I wanted to let you know that Vonda Feldbad-Brown is a senior fellow at Brookings in foreign policy. She specializes in she's also on the 21st Century Security and Intelligence program there. She's an expert in international studies, international conflicts, and counterinsurgency, organized crime, and illicit economies, if you will. And so on her first trip out here last year, she spoke about her work in Afghanistan. And when I learned how interested and involved she was in water, we really had to have her back to address this topic. On the academic side, she has her BA from Harvard and her PhD from MIT. She's been as a litany of publications that I won't go through. For those of you who are taking notes on her talk tonight, thanks to our friends here from Greenspun College, we record our lectures. We'll have them up on our Brookings Mountain website in a few days. So if you miss something, you'll be able to check on that. So with all that said, I will invite Vonda up here to get us started.
Thank you. Good evening. Is the mic working fine? Am I close enough? Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Bill, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming on what I understand is a day of mourning for the university for Tarek the Shark. I wished I could give you a uplifting talk today, and I'm afraid it will not be uplifting. Nonetheless, it is a topic of water theft, water smuggling, that is of vital importance to all of us and to some of us more acutely than others, and vital in the literal sense of the word, because without water, of course, there would be no life, not even for people, ecosystems, anyone. And indeed, water is a scarce commodity that's becoming scarcer. About 10 years ago, 1 billion of people around the world lacked access to safe drinking water, about a fifth at the time of the world's population. And 2 billion people lacked access to safe sanitation, with all the repercussions in terms of health, poverty, and other forms of marginalization. A quarter of people in Africa do not live in areas of chronic water stress. And by 2025, these numbers are expected to grow dramatically, with just about each of these categories worsening. So perhaps as many as 3 billion people in 2025 could live in chronically water-stressed areas, coping with basic access to drinking water. And indeed, already today, we see in many parts of the world very intense competition over water resources. That is not new, and in many ways, the history of human population is history of competition and access to water. But the problems are greatly magnified today as a result of multiple reasons. Population growth, above all, but also urbanization, increase in living standards, which on the one hand you might think would lead to perhaps innovation and smarter water use, but in fact is most often leading to overuse of water and much greater use than has been the case in the past. environmental degradation of many forms, classically pollution of water sources, but beyond that, and of course climate change, which is impacting access to water throughout the world in different but dramatic ways. And the more surface water is depleted, the more there is pressure on groundwater, as much of a problem, if a less visible problem, as pressure on surface water, but the far more difficult regulatory challenge, because use, overuse, abuse, theft of groundwater is far less visible than that of surface water. And so the problems that pervade devising good regulatory programs, free riding, backpacing, overuse, is magnified with groundwater. Now, strict legal compliance is not a guarantee of sustainable and efficient use. If the regulatory system is inadequate, if there is great capture by special interest of regulatory commissions, as well as simply because of the extraordinary complexity of what water regulation has to do. But nonetheless, in the absence of legal compliance, it is difficult to devise effective and effective regulatory system. And problems of insufficient pricing, cost avoidance, backpassing lead to overuse and problematic water management, and threats to long-term viability of water sources, and increasingly these days to even medium sustainability of water forces. So regulation of water needs to accomplish a bulk of goals, bulk of objectives. In the first place, it needs to sustain water for drinking and food. That means sustaining water for agriculture, but also preserving water for industry, energy, and obviously also viability of ecosystems. The last being often the least prioritized and least factored in aspect of regulation, but one that has multiple multiplier effects, often very problematic multiplier effects on the other categories as well. There is no standard agreed notion of how many liters of water a person needs per day, but nonetheless, most water experts will say this is about 50 liters of water, of which people need to drink daily about 2 or 3 liters, and the rest goes for cooking, bathing, sanitation, food production. Now, take a guess of how many liters of water goes into 1 cup of coffee. Anyone? 140. Now, obviously, this is not the magical bottomless cup of which the water just goes out. What the 140 liters of water accounts for predominantly is the invisible aspect of water. It is the water that is used for producing the coffee plant that will then produce 1 cup of coffee. And so the examples or the water needs that go into food production and our daily lives are far greater than what we actually see and conceive of as water uses. And indeed, 70% of water around the world is used for agriculture. Irrigation can have great effects on improving the productivity of agriculture, of plants, and has lifted many people out of poverty. But inappropriate use of water in agriculture has terrible cascade effects on ecosystem viability and ultimately can drive people back into poverty. And I'll come back to that when I talk about some of the examples of India and the way water smuggling plays a role in that. Now, I said that sort of the standard view is that people need at least 50 liters of water per day, an individual. How much water do you think people in the United States use per day? 400 to 600 liters. That is by far the most water-intense use of anywhere in the world. In Western Europe, people use about half of that. You have segments of populations in the Middle East, a place of deserts that are very profligate in water, and often access to water and access to great amounts of water are signs of wealth. in multiple ways. And you have people in parts of the world, as I mentioned, at least 1 billion of people that essentially have to cope with less than 50 liters and often do not have enough for drinking. I'll give you a little bit later in the talk some examples of how people struggle just to get enough water for drinking, forget other aspects of it. Now, water problems are not equally distributed around the world, and although you'll see later in the talk that water theft and many forms of water crimes, including smuggling, are prevalent throughout the world, they are differently intense in different parts of the world. So Canada, for example, has great water resources, and it has 40 times fewer people than China, but it has far more water than China, for example. And of course, Canada is much better than China in managing its water resources. China has terrible problem with industrial pollution and water degradation in many forms. Same is true for India, another place of of a large segment of the world's population. Terrible water mismanagement, huge pollution, huge degradation of surface water, and overexploitation of groundwater as well. 30 years ago, there were 2 million wells in India. And one of the reasons why India has improved greatly socioeconomically and lifted people out of poverty is green revolution, an aspect of which is irrigation and the interaction of irrigation as fertilizers. So 30 years ago, there were 2 million wells in India. Guess how many there are today? 23, 25? No one quite knows because many wells go unregulated, they are unregistered because people don't want to pay for water and they need to dig deeper and deeper. But nonetheless, in the span of 30 years, at least 10 times as much as it was before, from 2 million to 23 plus 25 million wells. And one of the reasons is not just green revolution and the lifting of people out of poverty, but it's also because water is priced very little in India. And in many jurisdictions, water is free. And you will often hear populations saying that water is a right, and people have the right to use water freely. And of course, this is very appealing to populations, especially populations that are poor or coming out of poverty. But the consequence then is very bad management of water and major degradation of water resources and drying up of groundwater as well. And indeed, that is a problem that urban slums in India, as well as urban slums anywhere in the world, in Mexico, in Africa, have to cope with. They often have no access to legal water. They often have no access to water, period. And as a result, you see the emergence of water smuggling into those marginalized, chronically deprived areas. But I caution you, and I'll speak a little bit later about the fact as well, that much water smuggling also takes place with the connivance participation and for the very wealthy, including major industries around the world, such as in India or Brazil, for example. Water and the illegality of water is a wicked problem from the perspective of addressing it from the perspective of policy responses. Because unlike other illicit economies, one cannot simply say that the proper response is suppression of illegality, suppression of smuggling. That presents excruciating moral dilemmas of cutting off some of the most marginalized, deprived poor people, to 1 billion or more, from access to water, which in the most extreme circumstances would mean death, literally killing people by thirst. But at the same time, if there is not effective regulation that does not mitigate or stop water crimes, then one can never achieve regulation that's effective enough to guarantee sustainability and guarantee long-term viability. So what are the threats that are posed by water crimes, by water theft, water smuggling? Well, the most extreme is the one that we have been talking so far about, which is the water security of users, both licensed users as well as unlicensed one. And overuse of water will start affecting not simply those who already exist at the margins or who already violate the regulations, but potentially also licensed users. And with greater water scarcity then comes rationing, increased price, insufficient availability. But overuse of water leads to also many other forms of degradation, such as increase in salination, intrusion of pollution of water resources. So if water tables, whether surface water or groundwater, drop too low, a whole cascade of negative effects takes place that further degrades water and water availability. The theft of water also presents other regulatory challenge and difficulty, namely that if the Water Commission, the state perhaps, does not collect enough revenue, it will not have the ability to repair and update systems, which leads to their degradation, increased leakage of many forms of pollution, potentially breakup of pipelines, loss of water through that, all compounded by great growth of urbanization. And this is not just the problem of poor countries around the world or developing countries. In many parts of the world, even in developed world, pipelines, water pipelines network are often more than a century old. And yet, citizens have often not been willing to devote taxes, resources to upgrading the water system. For example, in Washington, D.C., there's a very big debate going on about how to raise taxes to upgrade the pipeline network that is more than a century old and clearly inadequate for the city. Then think of megacities such as Karachi, where at least 20 million people live, 33 times the size of Las Vegas, I believe. Karachi requires daily 1,000 million gallons of water. Yet the pipeline network can at best support half of that. And much water is lost through theft, leakage, and smuggling. And so what it means is that a very vast majority of entities, citizens as well as businesses and households in Karachi, in one way or another, participate in water that's either privately distributed or very frequently illegally distributed. Another key threat of water is again one that we already talked about to some extent, which is to food security for crops as well as for grazing. And that's intimately linked to environmental ecosystem sustainability, where privileging of water use for agriculture often degrades surrounding ecosystem to the point that you see soil erosion, potentially forest collapse, of course great biodiversity loss, but then cascade effects, blowback effects back on agriculture, which will not have enough resources and often face a great deal of other problems. And yet, interest groups, agriculturists, farmers around the world want to have as much access to water as possible and are often not friendly disposed to either greater pricing or restrictions and rationings and love to violate the water permits they are given. Lack of access to water has great impacts on health, on disease spread, communicable diseases, as well as infant mortalities, and is in a very complex way linked to poverty. It also has impacts on sanitation, and we are increasingly seeing, for example, in India, linkages between sanitation and loss of human capital, human underdevelopment, even in places which are no longer poor, but where children are disabled for the rest of their life as a result of lack of access to clean water and clean sanitation. Water scarcity can lead to social strife, communal strife, riots like in Mumbai, riots in many parts of Africa when prices increase, say, 10 times as a result of scarcity. And under some circumstances, we are potentially going to see intrastate international conflicts over water. The Middle East being a classic example, with conflict between Turkey and Syria upstream states versus Iraq, in South China, in the South Asia area, where China is damming all of the rivers that go into India, and India feels extremely threatened by that move and perceives that as a matter of national security. Complex issues of water access between Afghanistan, Pakistan, between Pakistan and India. And in many of these areas, management of water is often seen as a very difficult, very conflictual security issue rather than a collaborative one, even though it can be transformed into a collaborative issue. And it is only a matter of time when the issue of intrastate conflict over water will also take on dimensions of water smuggling across international borders. Now let me give you a few more numbers about what is the size of water, water theft. Bill already mentioned that in many parts of the world, at least 30 to 50% of water use is illegal. It means essentially unpaid and outside of permits. In fact, the amount of water that is used every day through leakage and theft would be enough to provide water for 200 million people a day. Those are serious numbers. And again, this is not just the problem of developing countries, it's very much the problem of the developed world. In Southern Europe, for example, meaning Spain, Italy, Greece, and some of the smaller countries like Malta, for example, the number of unregulated users, people who use water without paying, without having a license, is equal to the numbers of users in the regulated sector. The demand of water that goes through illegal channels is equal to the volume of water that goes through legal channels. In Malta, the volume of water diverted without paying, water through water theft and water smuggling, is greater than the amount of water that goes through the sanctioned and paid for channels. And we see these numbers all in place after place. Karachi and Mumbai, New Delhi, 30 to 35% of water is smuggled illegally or stolen. Same numbers go for many cities in Africa. Now, there are very many forms that water theft and water smuggling takes place. In the most simple way is that people simply do not pay for the water that they use, and they use water in excess of what they are permitted. So they bore wells deeper than they should, and deplete the water table. Classic problem in India, very much augmented by the fact that diesel is subsidized very cheap, and so people who already don't pay for water to start with or pay very little can drill very deeply because they can buy pumps for which fuel is very cheap. So one crucial way of getting better regulation of water in India is to cut off subsidies for diesel. No politician has been willing to do that in decades. And in many parts of the world, there is also the water theft and water smuggling become far more sophisticated than simply overuse or not paying for water. It can involve establishing illegal pipelines. It can involve trucking water that's tapped illegally. Very complex schemes involving water regulators issuing licenses clearly in violations of principles to actors, perhaps establishing fake hydrants through which water is then channeled to others. Faking meters. Most hotels in developing world often used booster pumps, and they might be illegal and certainly head to water depletion. Much water is illegally used for the cultivation of narcotics. In Colombia, this can be coca. Now, Colombia is a water-rich country, but nonetheless, coca cultivation has very degrading effects on water sources. In Colombia, in the United States, and places like Oregon, before marijuana became legal there, a lot of water was illegally diverted and stolen from pipelines and wells for cultivation of marijuana, and it might still be illegally diverted for a future legal cultivation of marijuana. But perhaps the most glaring example is one of Yemen, a very poor country torn by conflict, where there's a prevalent use of khat, a mild narcotic, not illegal there, but extremely thirsty plant, disastrous in the area. And so the outcome is that the population of Sana'a, the capital, overwhelmingly depends on private or illegal sources of water. So much so that when there's essentially salt water for 0.15 per liter, $15 per liter, in a country where people make about $2 a day. So if you assume that that people would need 50 liters of water, they would pay to illegal vendors about $7.5 per day. Now their income is $2. So clearly they do not have the capacity to access 50 liters of water. But even if you just think of the water that's necessary for drinking, 2 to 3 liters, that would be about $0.45, so 45 cents. And even that is a very substantial portion of their income, essentially a quarter of their income just spent on being able to drink enough. And we see similar examples in places like El Salvador, Jamaica, Nicaragua, where the poorest households often spend 10% or more of their daily income on water. But when the problem of water regulation becomes particularly complex is when water mafias emerge that start distributing water to those who don't have enough access. And those could be water populations in the slums, which are often overwhelmingly dependent on these illegal providers, or even major industries which do not want to pay for the water they need and they want to use. And what is so difficult from the perspective of policy regulation is that those illegal providers of water often accumulate a great deal of political capital. The survival of the people in the slum depends on those water mafias that steal water or access water in some ways in another part of town and bring it into the slum. And these areas might be enormous. In Lagos, for example, a large city in Nigeria, 20 million people, today only about 5% of households and businesses are connected to a piped water system, 5%. And only 1% are connected to closed sewer system, essentially just hotels and high-income residences. So the rest of the population needs to depend on private actors, legal or illegal, who bring water in tanks, who sell water in little plastic bags, or simply scrape water from drainage, often drink water from sewage, from illegal boreholes, with all the, of course, terrible effects on sanitation, spread of diseases, etc. In Bangladesh, similar situation, the local slumlords called mastans often have their ability to control the slum precisely because they control access to water. And the pathway to becoming a slumlord is one of getting a monopoly on providing water to slum areas. And this is often done with the connivance or complicity, if you would like, of state authorities. Now, why is it that state authorities would be part of those smuggling mafias? Well, one reason is simply monetary, that those that sell water outside of the legal system, outside of the pipeline, often sell water for many times, 8, 10 times the cost of water through the official public pipeline system. And of course, they get kickbacks. And so we often paradoxically see a situation where even when the city finds the resources and motivation to want to extend pipeline networks, such as in places like Lagos or Delhi, but even places like Ecuador, the water mafias will actively prevent it. They'll provoke strikes, riots, actively destroy pipelines so that they continue having an illegal or extra-legal monopoly on water provision with both the financial rewards but also the political control this brings them over populations. And here is another aspect where the state often is complicit with that, because in many parts of the world, the middle class, upper classes essentially don't want to spend the resources of lifting people in the slums out of poverty, and they're quite happy to relegate control of the slums to extra-legal actors, illegal actors like the water mafias. And what better form of control there is than control over water, control over basic survival. And so, although in large parts of the world, populations are dependent on the smuggling of water, on water crimes for their survival, they obviously exist in extremely suboptimal and problematic equilibria and situations where their condition is better than having no access, but certainly very problematic. Now, why is it that we see this rather systematic regulatory failure? Part of it is just the complexity of understanding how water use affects a variety of domains I talked about, including ecosystems and the spillover effects. Let me give you an example from India, where urbanization has hugely compounded the problem of water use. Slums, very large parts, do not have any pipelines, because if settlements were established without permits, which slums are, then the state does not provide pipelines. And this is a form of using water as state making. The state does not want populations in those areas, does not want those poor populations, so it doesn't provide pipelines. Nonetheless, that has not scared off people from moving there, because they will tap into the water mafias. Nonetheless, those slums do not have enough water, and so those who illegally truck waters will go out into the rural areas to acquire water, either by drilling illegally there or cutting into pipelines there, or by also buying water from farmers who have a right to drill wells for agriculture. But it is far more profitable for the farmers to sell water to the water mafias than to use it for agriculture. Now, some of the water is then taken to the urban slum, but a lot of the water is also sold to industries in India that do not want to pay the price that even rather cheap water supply in India would demand of them. But the consequence of the farmers making money out of selling water is that there is massive overuse of water in the rural areas, which means that those localities dry up, the people can no longer exist there, whether in agriculture or selling water, and so they move to the urban peripheries, which compounds the problem of access to water, and the cycle intensified and perpetuates. So one aspect of the regulatory failure is simply lack of knowledge or great complexity, the very difficulty of monitoring groundwater. For example, what's happening with the Ogallala aquifer that supplies so much water to Western and Midwest United States, upstream, downstream community problems. But the other source of the problem is the one I spoke about, that access to water and provision of water is a mechanism of state making. A very brutal, often very discriminatory mechanism of state making, but one that nonetheless takes place. And in many parts of the world, it is the wealthy who essentially opt out of water regulation by having private pumps, private wells, being able to afford paying for water from private sellers, even legally sanctioned sellers, being able to invest in their own private water treatment systems. So they can opt out of regulation and caring about regulation. And it is the rising middle class that captures regulatory policy, often at the expense of the poor and marginalized. And beyond that, there is, of course, the other monetary complicity between the smuggling mafias, which very frequently are intimately connected to water commissions. So, in conclusion, what are then the ways to improve policy toward water? Well, one is just to start by recognizing the extent of water misuse, abuse, and the rising crimes in water, of which there will only be more, and they'll increasingly take on international dimensions, including in the aspect of smuggling. The other is recognizing that one shoe does not fit all problems. One policy response does not fit all problems. Obviously, if the key source of water theft is massive industry collusion with regulators, so water use is essentially legal but still inappropriate, then the issue is not cracking down on water smuggling, but making regulatory commissions be more accountable to a wider set of stakeholders. An essential start of any good water regulation is having good inventory and ability to monitor water. That is especially tough, but crucially necessary with respect to groundwater sources. It also means clearly establishing water rights. Again, a very often very difficult, very perplexing problems, especially in places where there are massive urbanization shifts, where a traditional regulation of water, customary rights and customary regulatory principles have weakened, and where land titles, water rights are often very opaque and very contested. Another aspect is insisting on better regulation by water authorities, which, as I mentioned, are often deeply corrupt and colluding with water mafias, by demanding transparency, external audits, external oversight, perhaps NGO monitoring. For regulation of any kind, including water, to be effective, people ultimately need to internalize it, or stakeholders need to internalize it. Well, that means that as many stakeholders need to become, in one way or another, part of water regulation. And that means including not just farmers and businesses, but also and particularly the poor who have traditionally been excluded. But wider inclusion is by itself not a solution often either, because people, especially poor people, often privilege immediate improvement to their livelihoods, not surprisingly. And so they will often privilege immediate improvements over long-term water sustainability. So water regulation needs to be informed and needs to include stakeholders who also have in mind long-term water sustainability across the range of issues, and biodiversity and complex ecological effects made all the more opaque, difficult, and uncertain as a result of climate change. But good water use and eliminating water theft often involves going beyond and away from water, such as eliminating agricultural subsidies, crucial for better water regulation in southern Europe, for example, eliminating fuel subsidies like diesel in India. And then there is the question of what one does with the mafias that illegally provide water. In some cases, they will have to be arrested. In other cases, however, simply eliminating them brings back the problem I started with, that the most poor, most marginalized will be cut off from access to water. So ideally, the state would be able to extend its presence, including through the pipeline network, to compensate for that. But if that is not realistic, then perhaps we can think of imaginative ways to bring some of the illegal sellers into the fold by giving them some sort of self-licensing. That it's difficult and not easy, there's many complexities. It's been tried with some level of effectiveness in places like Vietnam and Senegal, and Mozambique, for example. But what is crucial is not allowing the illegal or formerly illegal, semi-legal sellers to have monopoly and to be picky among who one licenses and whom one doesn't, because many of them are hardly Robin Hood types, very unscrupulous. And so much of water regulation is then a deeper reckoning of who we are as a people, who we are as a people in our relationship to the environment, but also who we are as citizens vis-a-vis each other. And so a lot of good water regulation is about the definition of social contract, the definition of exclusion or inclusion, all of which are extremely politically difficult. And with that also comes aspects of how water crimes are enforced. At what point will the police act with what levels of punishment? And one of the reasons why water regulation is difficult is that so much water theft is not visible. And there are big lag times between identifying that big leakages of water are occurring and the ability of even motivated authorities to act. That generates, again, a cascade of problems and stimulates crime. So how can we shorten the identification problem to be aware that water theft, water leakage is occurring, and develop an enforcement response along with that is swift and painful enough without creating other problems that it will create incentives for better, wiser use of water. Now, when people have faced scarcity in many different areas, they have two ways of coping. One is of innovation, so it can be, for example, desalination. Or one way is to become smarter users. And this is what I want to end on, that a crucial part of dealing with water crimes and water use is being far less profligate and being far more conscious about water use. And I am very pleased that I am saying that here in Las Vegas, where people are far more conscious and businesses are often far more conscious in how to conserve water than in other parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Wanda. While you have a sip of legally purchased water, please let me turn to the audience, and I hope we have a few questions, and we have time for some. Let me just encourage you to ask your question in the form of a question so that we can get as many people as possible. Anyone want to start? Right here, please.
Oh, okay. Well, very good speech, very interesting, and I guess my question: you've traveled to several dangerous areas of the world too, and I know I've read a little bit about how healthcare is sometimes linked to political and/or terroristic goals too. Like you will get healthcare if you follow our cause. Have you seen that with water too? I'm wondering have you seen that at all with water, that it's
yes. So the answer is yes, and there are different aspects to it. In Afghanistan, for example, the government is widely mistrusted in equitably, justly resolving conflicts over water, of which there are more than ever for a variety of reasons: return of refugee populations, demographic changes, land theft, water theft by those who became empowered after 9/11, often linked to the state. And so the Taliban is often better trusted than governing authorities in being the entity to go to resolve water disputes. So they don't provide water. It's not that the Taliban carries water in trucks and distributes it to drier communities, but they are often the entity to which people turn to resolve disputes over water theft that otherwise can escalate into violent conflict, which benefits the Taliban in other ways as well. In northern Nigeria, the place that you might be following because of the atrocities of Boko Haram is using water regulation in a far more malevolent way, trying to cut out certain communities from accessing water as a tool of displacing people. Similarly, ISIS threatened flooding large parts of Iraq, both to physically drown people and prevent Iraqi military from counterattack against ISIS, but also because they were very aware that seizing control of the dams and having dams would give them enormous political state-making power on who gets access to water and who doesn't. And of course, you have the other phenomenon, which is the criminal groups that provide water. Often the slumlords I talk about, for example, often have great political clout, and they can deliver votes to communities. Bangladesh is a good example. The way to become a slumlord is to become a water mafia don. And if you are a water mafia don, then you have really good grip on the community, and you can make sure that the community votes for the politicians that you are in cahoots with.
Yes, sir, in the back.
It seems that the illegal water consumption goes hand in hand with institutionalized corruption. Are there any incentives for government to reduce corruption and provide services?
Often it is indeed the case, and so there are many ways of water mismanagement, water crimes, water corruption, involving either industry capture, regulatory capture of water commissions, or having the collusion with water mafias. The key often is to look toward who are powerful actors who don't profit from the corrupt ways, from the way that water is managed, and who can be sufficiently influential challengers. So one way of reducing corruption is simply increasing transparency and expanding the board of stakeholders and that have access, or bringing poor communities into decision-making. The question is under what condition will have a water commission, and especially corrupt water commission colluding with water mafia, an interest in doing greater transparency and bringing, for example, the previously excluded to the discussion. And so who are the external actors who don't profit from the corrupt way and who will politically benefit from challenging the corrupt way is often the key. Now, the critical question is how to make that institutionalized beyond particular individuals, beyond particular moments of opportunity. In some ways, though, I'm more optimistic about that, simply about providing water to some of the slum areas, than about the more difficult regulatory issue, the background issue, such as cutting of subsidies for agriculture, cutting of subsidies for fuel, for diesel fuel, for water pumps. They, in some ways, are not corrupt in the sense of taking place outside of law. They're perhaps corrupt in the moral sense, and that they are not optimal in terms of long-term interest and sustainability. But they often are critical background factors for scarcity and smuggling, and getting at those is often more politically difficult than even just acting against the very clearly corrupt link in water mismanagement.
Sir,
I was just going to ask, as far as Americans and what they pay for water, it's relatively cheap compared to, say, Europe or the rest of the world. Do you think raising water prices in the U.S. would help water conservation here?
Yes.
Yeah.
But try to be a politician running on that platform.
Yeah, exactly. So how would you go about getting them to raise water prices without everyone basically freaking out over it because they don't want to pay more?
Well, I think that it is obligatory on politicians and experts to be simply informing the public that
there is a bigger problem.
there is a massive problem that will not be resolved, and part of dealing with it is raising price. Now, it's not just pricing issue that's a problem. I mean, in the U.S., I spoke about the Ogallala aquifer. Lots of it is downstream, upstream communities, classic problem throughout the world. But nonetheless, yes, I think that the overall pricing needs to be much higher than it is. And one can think of smart pricing. For example, you can establish a baseline amount that would be necessary for food production, for drinking, basic sanitation in a household, and then say, and everything about this baseline, whatever you say it is, 100 liters if you don't want to say 50, 200 liters if you want to be generous, everything else like swimming pools is going to be priced at much greater rate. That is, in my view, an effective scheme. You can think of other pricing systems saying a household at poverty line will face different pricing than richer household. That's complex. It's not easy because it can lead to the India problem of the poor selling water for the rich who still avoid the greater price, or the middle class. But yes, bottom line is prices need to go high up. But getting governments, local governments, state governments to raise prices appropriately is difficult. And I would link that to just cutting out of subsidies from sectors that should not be industries, that should not be water-based energy production, that should not be agriculture in places which are extremely water intense and just don't make sense environmentally or economically.
Well, for Sarah?
You mentioned international conflict. And two questions about that, if I may. Which is a greater problem, the water theft or the potential of severe conflict over water rights and difficulties with countries? And number two, what is being done to ameliorate or try to avoid those conflicts?
It's a tough question. What is a bigger problem? I would say at the end of the day, the bigger problem is overuse of water, of which smuggling is a component. Now, this doesn't mean that in every single instance of smuggling of water, the problems are of equal effects and equal consequences. And so in some cases, very bloody conflict of water would, of course, generate tremendous problems. I mean, think about a conflict over water between India and Pakistan. The two countries are at knives edge very frequently over a variety of other issues, but meanwhile, India has big water problems, Pakistan many times more magnified. Pakistan's drying up massively, and it has a whole host of problems. It depends on water from India or Afghanistan, both countries with which it has very difficult relations. The potential of conflict escalated there over water would lead to terrible conflict potential involving nuclear weapons with the repercussions for the rest of the world. In that case, I would say the prospect of conflict between India and Pakistan is far more threatening than, for example, water smuggling in Tijuana, of which there is quite a bit. So it depends, but I would say overall the effects on the entire planet, especially when intersected with climate change, are probably even greater of water use or overuse of water, and they will potentially generate terrible conflict. Now, there are ways to mitigate conflicts. And in fact, in the setting of India and Pakistan, to come back to the example, the agreement from the 1950s over the managing of the Indus River and several other rivers, water that originates in India and goes into Pakistan, are often held as the high point of collaboration between the two countries, which used a potential crisis into developing rather collaborative relationship. I also believe that the collaborative relationship is weakening, and more one hears, particularly from the Pakistanis, deep dissatisfaction with the arrangement and very much a sense that they are being mistreated by India. However true or not that is, that's the prevailing perception. And so increasingly, the issue that has been seen as an issue of model of collaboration with positive spillovers into other domains is becoming a very hostile, very tense relationship between the countries. Depending on how rich a country is and how rich the neighbors are, they can avoid conflict by going to hard solutions such as desalination of water. It has many problematic environmental effects in terms of carbon. It's hardly an optimal policy, but it's certainly a policy available to countries. So if they are cut off from water supply and they don't want or cannot go to war with neighbors, or the war would not resolve anything, they can resort to other generation of water, perhaps buying water in other forms. But one of the things that's very different about water compared to other commodities is it's extremely heavy. It's one of the most priciest things to carry on ships, on trucks, and that influences both the illegal side of it and profits and regulation, as well as the legal side of it, such as countries that are drying up, buying waters from elsewhere.
Right in front here, ma'am?
Are there any nonprofits here in the U.S. that you know of that we as a community could help support?
Yes, and I don't want to, just off the top of my head, told you, okay, here are the good ones, here are the bad ones. But there are quite a few actors in the US, and we can have offline discussion perhaps, about which try to get involved in one way or another in water provision and potentially water regulation in various parts of the world. And there is a very varied effectiveness impact. And I think it's quite imperative to monitor the auditors and to monitor the NGOs. Not all nonprofits produce benevolent outcomes. But yes, there's quite a wide field, and being very conscious of what kind of effects they actually have, I would say it's critical for support, or for choosing to support or not.
Ma'am, in the back there?
Do you see around the world a change in agriculture from growing more intensive water usage crops to less intensive ones?
It varies enormously by place. In some places that is indeed happening, but hardly in all places. Much of the green revolution in India, of which India is quite actively trying to export to Africa, is very water intense and involves fertilizers which are not appropriate for sub-Saharan Africa. So there's same goes for Brazil, although it's a little bit better in the case of Brazil. But look at California. You have traditional areas which were devoted to cultivation of nuts, and these are being shifted to cultivation of grapes for wine because they're much more profitable. They're, however, absolutely disastrous from a water perspective, yet what regulator in California, even in the drought that California is going through, will necessarily deny water permits? Clearly, the answer there is that sure, you should be allowed to grow grapes, but you need to pay a very heavy price for the water that you're going to use. But these pricing mechanisms are not in place. And so although people are switching from much less water-intense nuts to grapes, very bad for water in California, the pricing is still the old one, very inappropriate for the crop. So in some parts of the world, we see people switching to more ecologically sustainable, smarter water use. In many parts of the world, that's not the case.
I want to be respectful of your time, but so I want to thank Vonda for a fascinating talk, and thank you for some great questions. Before I let you go, I just want to put in a plug. We'll be back in 2 weeks with our next lecture. It'll be on a related topic, so I expect to see all of you here. We're going to have Elizabeth Ferris out from Brookings, and she's going to talk about climate change on a global level, including natural disasters and human rights and how that interplay. So we'll be around if you have some questions that you still have or didn't have time to ask. And I hope we see you in a couple weeks. Thanks for coming.